Margaret Holloway rarely spoke to anyone past sundown. Her evenings were sacred, slow rituals of chamomile tea, quiet humming, and the creak of old floorboards beneath wool slippers. After 72 years of mostly saying yes to others, she'd earned her solitude. That night, like most others, she sat in her rocking chair facing the back garden. The sky outside Port Orchard was painted in long strokes of orange and violet, the kind that made the Douglas firs look like brushwork on a forgotten canvas. A low rustle came from the tall grasses near the fence. Margaret didn't flinch. She simply turned her head, waiting. Then, with a silent glide, Juniper emerged. Not everyone keeps a bobcat as a companion. Fewer still raise one like a daughter. But Juniper wasn't raised. She arrived. 5 years earlier, Margaret had been walking her usual trail behind the creek bed where the moss climbs the trees and the air tastes like pine in memory. She'd gone off the path, something she never did, drawn by a faint whimpering sound. Beneath a fallen branch, tangled in fishing wire, was a wild cat baby, barely the size of a cantaloupe, blood matted into her fur. Margaret acted on instinct, not logic. She wrapped the kitten in her scarf and carried her home. The veterinarian warned her gently, "It's a bobcat, ma'am, not a house pet." Margaret nodded. She fed her warmed milk with an eyedropper and named her Juniper. It was supposed to be temporary, but days passed. Then seasons, then years. Juniper grew, sleek, alert, quiet. Her paws padded across the house like shadows. She liked resting near the old heater vent in the winter and watching hummingbirds in the spring. Margaret learned her signals. The flick of a tail meant, "Leave me a steady gaze," meant, "I trust you." They lived like that, not quite wild, not quite domestic. Margaret's home, filled with old books and hand-painted mugs, somehow adjusted. So did the town eventually. At first, people said things, whispered warnings at the grocery store. "She's lost it, keeping a wild animal like that. It's dangerous. Those creatures don't love you back." Margaret never argued. But one day at the local post office, she simply said, "I once had a husband who barely spoke to me." Juniper listens. There was silence after that, and a little more respect. Every evening, Juniper returned from her roamings at the edge of the forest. Always at the same time, always on the same garden path. And Margaret would whisper, "There she is," as if to remind herself she hadn't imagined it all. The companionship between them was soft, not showy. Juniper didn't lick faces or nuzzle. But when Margaret had her dizzy spells, Juniper stayed near the foot of the bed. When the night got too cold, she curled along the edge of the blanket. There's a kind of animal love you can't train, it just happens. Wild animal rescue videos often show the dramatic moments, the shaking hands, the cries of relief. But Margaret knew the quieter truth. The real rescue happens in the silence afterward, when no one's filming, when the house feels warm because someone else is breathing in it. She often wondered why Juniper stayed. The door was always open, the woods just steps away. Bobcats are solitary by nature. But perhaps Juniper knew the same thing Margaret did, that choosing someone is more powerful than needing them. Margaret wasn't ignorant of what Juniper was. She kept her instincts sharp. She never invited neighborhood children over without warning. She posted signs along the fence, "Wildlife Companion on premises. Please respect her space." She knew the difference between a cute animal video and real animal companionship. This wasn't about domesticating nature. It was about coexisting with it. But there were quiet risks. Last spring, Juniper returned with a torn ear, most likely from another bobcat or a coyote. Another time, she didn't come home for 2 full nights. Margaret barely ate. When Juniper finally padded in, wet from rain, Margaret didn't scold. She just knelt, letting the wild cat lean into her chest, as if acknowledging what they both knew: their time was delicate. Evenings were their rhythm, the rocking chair, the smell of cinnamon oil, the soft purr that came not from Juniper's throat. Bobcats rarely purr, but from her body, her presence. And sometimes Margaret would speak aloud. vast, great mystery," she'd whisper. "And I think that's why I trust you." That trust was tested more than once. One afternoon, a county officer knocked on her door. Someone had reported a large predator in a backyard. Margaret invited him in. Juniper was curled by the fireplace, eyes half-lidded, tail twitching once every few seconds. The officer stood frozen. Margaret made tea. "She won't bite," Margaret said softly. "Unless you bite first." The officer left in silence, unsure what to file. There was an understanding in town after that. You didn't mess with Margaret or her bobcat. Still, life had changed. 5 years ago, Margaret wouldn't have opened her home to anything with claws. She hadn't even wanted a cat. But Juniper changed more than the atmosphere of the house. She changed Margaret herself. The rhythms of caretaking gave her purpose. The quiet presence softened her resentment of old age. Many older women, especially those widowed, are told to take up knitting or join a book club. Few are encouraged to reconnect with nature, let alone with something as wild and unpredictable as a bobcat. Margaret often said to herself, "I don't need to be looked after. I need to be needed." And Juniper somehow needed her, or chose her. It's hard to say which matters more. A few times, Margaret thought about making a documentary. She'd watched plenty of wild animal rescue and cute animal videos online. But her bond with Juniper didn't belong in a viral compilation. It wasn't funny or thrilling. It was just steady, real. Maybe that's why it was beautiful. The only hint of instability came in the form of that fence. A thin wooden barrier that separated her yard from the lot next door, recently sold after 3 years vacant. Margaret had ignored the for sale sign until the day it disappeared. A new neighbor would bring questions, curiosity, and likely a dog. Margaret didn't hate dogs. Not really. Her late husband had kept a Labrador that once tore up her favorite hydrangeas. She'd tolerated it the way she tolerated so many things then. But now, with Juniper, a barking dog could change everything. Bobcats were territorial. And Juniper, though gentle with Margaret, had instincts older than her training. Still, the house next door remained quiet for 2 weeks. No trucks, no commotion. She allowed herself to hope perhaps it would be another retiree, or better yet, someone who respected the quiet. Then, one crisp Monday morning, she heard the rattle of a U-Haul truck backing into the gravel, and a bark, so deep, so resonant, it seemed to shake the wind chimes by the porch. Juniper, by the window, stood still. Her fur bristled. Margaret reached for her cane, not to walk, but out of reflex. Like an old soldier hearing a bugle, she watched from the curtains. A man, broad-shouldered and sunburned, wrestled open the tailgate of the truck. Out leapt a massive dog, gray and tan like a small lion. It barked again. Loud. Confident, territorial. Juniper didn't move, just stared, a quiet challenge. Margaret whispered, "Oh dear." What followed was not war, not yet. But it was the beginning of something. A clash of instincts, a meeting of opposites, and in the middle a widow holding her breath, the fence held. That first day anyway. But Margaret knew better than to trust wood against nature. The question wasn't if they'd meet, it was when. And when they did, what would her gentle bobcat become? Bruno didn't walk, he thudded. Each paw hit the earth like a dropped hammer, sending ripples through Margaret's chest even from across the yard. It started with the bark. That deep, primal sound that made birds lift off trees and Juniper freeze by the window pane. Margaret had heard dogs before. Haven Ridge wasn't exactly a city, but this bark was different. It didn't ask, it announced. She lowered the teacup gently onto its saucer and walked to the front door. Juniper was already there, crouched low ears, flat, her breath invisible but loud in Margaret's ears. The bobcat's eyes tracked something through the lace curtains. Margaret followed the gaze. Next door, a man stepped out of the truck. He was younger than she expected, mid-30s maybe. Wore boots too clean for a laborer and a hoodie pulled over a buzzed head. He opened the back of the U-Haul and out leapt the beast. Not wild, not loose, just enormous, Bruno was a Cane Corso. She would later learn a breed known more in working fields than neighborhoods. Built like a panther, head like a boulder, muscles that twitched with each movement. He sniffed, lifted a leg against a fence post, and then barked again, 3 times, each louder than the last. Juniper didn't flinch. She stared. Tail, rigid, breath measured. Her kind didn't bluff. Margaret whispered, "Not now, sweet girl." That evening, Bruno barked for 47 minutes. Margaret counted, not out of spite, just fear. Fear of what it could become. She didn't call the sheriff. She didn't write a letter. She made banana bread. The next morning, Margaret walked slowly to the new neighbor's porch loaf wrapped in a dish towel, palms damp. When the door opened, she expected hostility or worse, polite distance, but the man just blinked like he hadn't seen a visitor in weeks. "I'm Margaret," she said. "That's Juniper." She gestured back toward her porch, where a tawny blur curled under a hanging fern. The man looked past her to the Bobcat. "Is that a wildcat she used to be?" He didn't laugh, didn't recoil, just nodded once. "I'm Matt," he said, "and that's Bruno. He's a lot." They stood like that for a moment. 2 people with wild animals and quieter reasons. Bruno pushed past him, straining the leash, barking as if declaring war on the quiet. Juniper stood on the porch rail, high and still. Her body didn't move, but Margaret could feel her calculating. Matt pulled Bruno back. "Sorry, he's still settling." "He's loud," Margaret said, not unkindly. "He's been through a lot," Matt replied, like that was enough. And maybe it was. Later, back inside, Margaret watched Bruno pacing the edge of his new yard, sniffing every inch of the grass. He marked corners, dug once, barked toward a bird. Margaret kept her tea steady as Juniper's tail flicked against her leg slowly. A silent code. In the days that followed, the uneasy rhythm became routine. Juniper patrolled from her elevated perches, windowsills, porch rails, the roof on dry afternoons. Bruno responded with warning barks and low growls. Their worlds were divided by a 6-foot cedar fence that felt thinner each day. It wasn't hatred, it wasn't chaos, but it was pressure. Margaret started walking to the fence line, more often pretending to check her garden beds. She'd never cared much for vegetables, but now her radishes were immaculate. She needed the pretense and excuse to gauge the tension. She worried about what would happen if Juniper made the wrong move. Bobcats don't back down, and Cane Corsos don't either. Matt seemed aware. He reinforced the fence with stronger planks, put in a locking gate, apologized more times than necessary. "He's not aggressive," he said once. "He's just protective." "I understand," Margaret replied, and she did. People often mistake protectiveness for aggression, especially in animals. But the same was true of people. Matt looked like someone who had to build fences not just in yards, but in his life. The kind who learned to bark before someone else bit. One afternoon they met by the mailbox. Matt had mud on his boots and a tiredness in his eyes that seemed older than he was. He was a fire dog, he said suddenly, trained to search to pull to bark when things weren't safe. Margaret nodded. She didn't ask what went wrong. Instead, she told him how Juniper once dragged her shawl into the backyard and curled up on it for an hour. She knew I'd lost someone that morning, my sister, and she brought me the only thing that smelled like comfort. Matt looked down at the ground, then back at the house. Bruno sleeps by the door every night. If I leave for even an hour, he checks all the windows. Margaret smiled. They don't just live with us, they read us. They didn't talk long, but something shifted. The space between their homes felt less like a border, more like a bridge. Still, the tension between the animals remained. Bruno barked less, but his eyes stayed fixed on Juniper whenever she was in view. Juniper didn't hiss or lunge, but she never turned her back. Their standoff became ritual, like 2 generals honoring a ceasefire, but never putting down arms. It was Matt who finally said it. "They're trying to decide who owns the land." Margaret laughed, surprised by the accuracy. "I think they both do, and we're just the tenants." That evening, Juniper didn't return at sunset. Margaret stood by the porch with a flashlight voice hoarse from calling. Bruno barked twice, short-clipped. Then silence. She waited until midnight. Juniper came home at 2. Damp fur, a scratch near her jaw, no explanation. Bruno barked once. It was Margaret's first real warning. The Bobcat wasn't safe. Not from Bruno, not from something else, and not from herself. Margaret spent the next day online reading stories of wild animal rescue, animal behavior patterns in mixed pet households. She found forums, stories of bobcats and domestic pets living side by side, some successful, most not. The keyword threads were filled with tension: wild cat, baby meets dog, can bobcats be pets, animal rescue gone wrong. She closed the laptop and made a decision. That night, she called Matt over. They sat on opposite porch steps, feet brushing wild mint. "We need to talk about them," she said. Matt nodded. "I've been thinking the same." They talked through every scenario: what might trigger a fight, what signs to watch for, what to do if one of them got loose. "I don't want anyone getting hurt," Matt said. "I don't want to lose her," Margaret whispered. "Then we'll figure it out." And for a moment, the fence between them vanished. Coexistence doesn't come from taming, it comes from watching, listening, adjusting. Whether it's between animals or people, peace is rarely natural. It's chosen daily. Margaret began carrying a small spray bottle with her in the garden, not for aggression, just as a signal. She placed a bell near Juniper's outdoor perch so she could track movement. Matt worked with Bruno on leash signals and calming commands. They didn't wait for something to go wrong. They prepared for what could. Still, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling this was only the beginning. The stillness between the animals felt less like resolution, more like the pause before a storm. Juniper had grown restless. Bruno's eyes tracked more than movement, they tracked energy. One day, the wind picked up. Clouds thickened. Margaret placed her rocking chair indoors. Juniper paced the window. Bruno barked 3 times sharp, urgent, and then in the distance, crack. A tree branch fell. The gate, improperly latched, gave way. The fence trembled, and Margaret's heart did the same. The moment wasn't loud. Not yet. But it was coming. The air smelled like cedar and something older instinct, and when the fence finally fell, it wouldn't just be wood that broke. The storm didn't roar. It crept. By early evening, the sky over Port Orchard had thickened into that strange green-gray color that made the birds quiet and the pine trees shift like they were whispering. Margaret stood at the kitchen sink, hands sunk in warm dishwater, eyes on the garden. Juniper was unusually still, crouched under the bench, her tail flicking every few seconds. Bruno barked, once, then again, sharper. Margaret dried her hands and moved to the porch. The wind pushed against her face, heavy with salt from the bay. She looked at the back fence. The gate rocked slightly, its latch loose, after weeks of Matt meaning to fix it. He'd said something about it the day before, but life had gotten in the way. Or maybe Hope had that belief that if nothing bad had happened yet, maybe nothing would. Hope is beautiful. It's also lazy. The first crash came around 8 to 12 p.m., a heavy Douglas fir branch slamming into the far corner of the yard. Margaret didn't see the impact, but she heard it. The deep thud, the sharp splinter, then silence, then Bruno. The barking didn't stop this time. It rose, urgent, then closer. Margaret grabbed her coat. "Stay inside," she whispered to Juniper, who was already on her feet. But Juniper didn't listen. By the time Margaret made it to the back steps, the gate had swung open. The broken branch had crushed the hinges, and through the blur of wind and movement, she saw them. Juniper at full height, tail raised, ears back. Bruno low and forward, growling but not lunging. It wasn't a fight, not yet. But it wasn't nothing. Margaret froze, her voice caught. Juniper back, Bruno stay, neither moved. Matt's footsteps pounded across his porch. Bruno. Here. Bruno flinched, Juniper didn't. And then it happened. Bruno stepped forward. Just one step. Juniper growled. A short, sharp sound like tearing fabric. Bruno stopped. For several long seconds, the two animals stared at each other. Not with hatred, with calculation. Bruno wasn't the enemy. He was the question. Juniper didn't leap. She didn't hiss. She stepped sideways slow and measured, putting herself between Bruno and Margaret. Bruno sat, just like that. No commands, no violence. He sat down in the mud chest, heaving eyes still locked on Juniper. Matt exhaled. He's listening. Margaret didn't speak. She was watching Juniper. The bobcat's muscles relaxed just enough to be noticeable. Her tail dropped to the grass, and in that second, Margaret realized Juniper wasn't protecting herself. She was protecting Margaret. It struck her like a quiet truth. So many people still saw animals as instinct, as impulse. But what if that wasn't all? What if there was something else at play? Something beyond training or taming? A loyalty formed not from ownership, but from shared silence. That's when the lights went out. A transformer blew somewhere down the road. The sudden darkness was complete. The wind pressed harder. Margaret heard the porch chimes clatter and fall. A tree groaned nearby. She stepped back toward the house. Juniper, come. But Juniper didn't follow. She was still watching Bruno, who was now rising to his feet, distracted by the movement of the trees. He barked. Once, loud. Juniper darted, not at him, away, toward the tree line behind Matt's property. Juniper, Bruno followed. Matt swore, no Bruno, stay. Too late. Margaret's cane hit the porch rail as she ran. Her breath caught halfway down the steps. She wasn't built for running, but she didn't stop. Matt was already climbing over the shattered gate. They're heading for the woods. Margaret reached the edge of the lawn, heart pounding. Her voice cracked. Juniper. No answer. Just wind. They were gone. Gone. The next hour was a blur of flashlights and soaked boots. Margaret, wrapped in a quilt, now walked the edge of her property, calling Juniper's name until her voice frayed. Matt drove up and down the side road's windows down, calling for Bruno. The rain eased just after midnight, but the silence that followed felt heavier. At 1:30 a.m., Matt returned. Nothing. Margaret didn't cry. Not yet. She just sat on the porch steps, quilt clutched to her knees, staring at the open gate. Her mouth moved without sound. Matt knelt beside her. I'll keep looking. First light. Margaret nodded. Her fingers twitched. She whispered, she wouldn't run unless she had to. Bruno doesn't chase unless he means to protect. They sat in silence. The porch light flickered back to life, flicked once and held. Margaret finally spoke. I should have stopped this. Should have insisted on a new fence. Told you to leash him always. Matt shook his head. You were trying to let them live. Another pause. Then Margaret said, she was never meant to be caged. I thought she chose this. She did, Matt said. She'll come back. Not if she's afraid. Matt looked down at his hands. Then we have to show her she isn't. By sunrise, Margaret had made a plan. Flyers, a call to the vet clinic, a message in the local paper. Matt helped her draft a post for the community board. It read, Lost, 2 animals, 1 wild, 1 loyal. Juniper, a tawny bobcat with a silver collar. Bruno, a large gray cane corso, last seen near the edge of Maple Hollow Trail. They are not dangerous, but they are afraid. If you see them, please don't chase. Just call. They are family. They printed 20 copies, then 40 more. Matt stapled them to trail signs. Margaret slipped them into mailboxes. They worked quietly side by side. They didn't talk much, but they stayed close. That night, Margaret sat on her porch alone. The wind had calmed. The fence still leaned open. She whispered, find each other, because maybe that was the only way back. The walls we build fences, fears, assumptions don't protect us from chaos. Sometimes they delay it, but when they fall, we see more clearly who we are and who we're willing to chase into the dark. Margaret left the porch light on, not because she believed it would guide Juniper home, but because hope needs light, even if it flickers. Inside, her house was too quiet. The mug on the table had gone cold. The food in Juniper's dish sat untouched, and Margaret, for the first time in years, locked the door behind her, not to keep anything out, but to keep herself from waiting all night by the window. In the woods, beyond the neighborhood, beneath thick branches and cold stars, two animals meant to fear each other wandered side by side, and their journey was just beginning. Juniper didn't come home the next day. Not by sunrise, not by sunset. Margaret had left the back door slightly ajar, just like always. The porch light had stayed on through the night, a soft glow that flickered against the wind. But in the morning, the cushion where Juniper usually curled was cold and untouched. There were no paw prints, no broken branches, no note from the universe that said, "She's okay." Matt stopped by before noon. He'd already walked the full mile stretch behind the properties and hiked the lower edge of Maple Hollow Trail. He'd called Bruno's name until his throat gave out. "She's not in the ravine," he said, wiping dirt from his palms, and he didn't head toward the main road. "I checked the cameras at the general store." Margaret nodded too quiet. Her fingers held a chipped pencil. She was drawing a map by hand. Little arrows showing places Juniper used to nap old deer paths. She sometimes traced the berry thickets she liked near the waterline. "She knows the woods," Margaret finally said, "but she's not wild. Not anymore." Matt looked out at the trees. "Bruno isn't either, but instinct doesn't ask for permission." They started printing more flyers. Margaret wrote the words herself. "Lost, Bobcat and Cairn Corso. Juniper, female bobcat, silver-gray scar on right ear, orange collar. Bruno, large gray dog, yellow eyes, very muscular. Last seen edge of Fernwood Grove, 900 p.m. During storm. They are loved. They are not dangerous. They are afraid." She couldn't stop herself from writing "they are loved." It felt foolish, but also true. They posted flyers at the co-op, the bus shelter, the community garden fence. A teenage girl helped tape one to the post office window. A man at the bakery asked if it was the same bobcat he saw sleeping once under Margaret's lilac bush. A park ranger took 5 extras and promised to keep an eye out. Word spread. One older man said he saw something cat-shaped running along the creek bed that morning. A jogger reported hearing unusual barking near the abandoned orchard, but nothing solid, nothing confirmed. Matt borrowed a pair of thermal binoculars and camped at the edge of the woods overnight. He took jerky flashlights and one of Bruno's blankets. He came back empty-handed. Meanwhile, Margaret started sleeping on the couch close to the door, just in case. Her nights blurred into half-dreams of rustling branches and imagined growls. Every creak in the house pulled her upright. It had been 2 days. On the 3rd morning, Margaret went to the porch and found a feather. One single perfect black feather sitting in the food bowl. No scratches, no paw prints, just the feather. She stared at it for a long time. It wasn't Juniper's. It didn't belong to any bird she recognized either. It felt like something left behind on purpose. She picked it up gently. Inside, she placed it on the windowsill. That same day, Matt walked over holding something crumpled, a soaked, chewed corner of the blanket Bruno had taken into the woods. He found it near the stream bend, right where the map said Juniper sometimes hunted frogs. "It's something," he said. "It's not them," she replied. Still, Margaret folded the fabric and placed it on her kitchen chair. Later that evening, she lit a candle. No ceremony, just quiet light. "Come back," she said aloud. Not pleading, just clear. The stillness that followed was sharp. It made the hum of the fridge seem too loud. That night, she finally broke. In the smallest way, she poured a second cup of tea and placed it opposite her own on the table. No one sat there. But she kept talking, not loud, not poetic, just sentences, just what she'd say if Juniper were curled at her feet. "I'm not angry," she whispered. "I just miss you." Matt called at midnight. "I think they're together." "What makes you say that?" "Because if they weren't, we'd have found one." That sentence sat heavy in the room long after the call ended. Margaret didn't sleep. The next morning, she called the Animal Rescue Center in Tacoma. She didn't know what she expected. Maybe someone had found Juniper and assumed she was a stray. Maybe someone had tried to take Bruno in, mistaking him for a lost guard dog. But the center had no reports, no recent Bobcat sightings, no dogs matching Bruno's breed either. "I just want them safe," Margaret said, her voice trembling at the end. The woman on the line paused, then said softly, "Sometimes animals go quiet before they find their way back." It was a small sentence, but it helped. That afternoon, Matt returned from another loop around the lower trail with an idea. What if we made a scent trail? Something familiar, for both of them. They worked quietly. He carried Bruno's leash and collar. Margaret brought one of Juniper's toys, a small leather mouse she used to bat around the porch. They laid the items near the tree line, spaced them apart along known paths. Pieces of clothing, Margaret's scarf, the corner of her quilt. At one point, Matt stopped and said, "When my father died, Bruno wouldn't leave the door for 3 days." Margaret didn't answer, but she understood. Animals grieve even if they don't show it the way we do. That night, the wind died completely. The forest held its breath. Margaret lit another candle. She read aloud from her gardening journal. She left the door cracked again. Still no Juniper, still no Bruno. The stillness settled into her bones. By the end of the week, Margaret stopped making the flyers. She didn't give up, but she realized something. Maybe the point wasn't to force them home. Maybe it was to hold space for them to return when they were ready. She began writing instead. A letter to Juniper, then to Bruno, then one to herself. "Dear girl, I never meant to keep you, but you stayed anyway. Maybe that means something." Matt came over that night with 2 mugs of cider and said, "We'll keep looking. But I also think we're not alone out here. People are watching, caring. It's strange. I've lived here 6 weeks, and I know more neighbors now than I ever did in Seattle." Margaret smiled. "You know what they say. A lost animal brings a town together faster than an election." There was a truth to that, something unspoken, a shared softness among strangers when animals were involved. Videos of animal rescue filled Margaret's suggested tabs online now. Clips of cute animals, wild cats, baby bobcats, even stories about dogs and wild animals becoming friends. She watched one in silence, a rescued fox and a German shepherd napping together in a hammock. She didn't cry, but something cracked open quietly. Sometimes we want closure. Other times what we need is the reminder that peace can come in wild forms. Losing something you love doesn't mean it's gone. It might just be on its own journey. Some bonds stretch beyond fences, beyond time. All we can do is trust the thread holds. 1 week passed, then 9 days. On the 10th day, a knock at the door. A boy no more than 9 stood there holding a crumpled flyer. "I think I saw them," he said. Margaret's breath caught. He pointed toward the western edge of the woods near the overgrown path few people used anymore. They were together. "I saw the cat first, then the big dog. They looked like they were walking each other. He had wide eyes, honest ones." Margaret didn't wait. She called Matt, grabbed her coat, slipped the toy mouse into her pocket, and walked toward the forest, her footsteps steady. In the thick woods beyond town, under pine needles and low clouds, 2 creatures once at odds had found their own rhythm. And what they learned there might change everything. They hadn't planned to survive together, but that's what happened. Bruno and Juniper had run into the woods without hesitation. For one, it was instinct. For the other, it was loyalty. For both, it became necessity. The first night was bitter. The rain returned. Trees groaned. The wind hollowed through the hollows like an old voice. Juniper stayed low to the ground, using a fallen log for cover. Bruno stayed near, shivering slightly, glancing toward her every time the wind cracked a branch. There was no fire, no food, just cold, wet survival. Juniper moved first, slipping into the brush, disappearing like breath in the dark. Bruno stood at the edge, unsure. He wasn't trained for this. His world had always included walls, doors, bowls, filled by hands. But he followed. That was the first lesson. Follow what you don't understand quietly. Juniper didn't lead him far. Just to a dry patch under a canopy of cedars where the moss absorbed their breathing and nothing smelled like fear. She didn't curl beside him, but she didn't leave either. They didn't sleep, not fully. By dawn, hunger pressed into both of them like a dull ache. Juniper knew how to hunt, not in the majestic wild cat way you see in wildlife rescue documentaries, but in the slow, practiced movements of a creature who had once stalked frogs under Margaret's porch light. She padded toward the creek, silent. Bruno watched, then whined. She paused, tail twitching, waited. He followed, stepping with a clumsy softness that was surprising for his size. At the edge of the water, Juniper crouched low. Her ears shifted, her paw hovered, then a swipe. She missed, but the motion triggered something in Bruno. He leapt, landing with a splash, not graceful, but effective. A stunned fish flopped onto the rock. Bruno barked in surprise, backing up, unsure what to do. Juniper pounced. This time she didn't miss. They shared it, not like humans might, cutting pieces with care, but in the wild way of survival. A few bites each. No growls, no stealing, just hunger answered. That was the second lesson. Survival makes strangers into companions. The day grew hotter. They moved uphill. Juniper led by scent. Bruno lagged, panting. Still, he never stopped watching her. When she paused, he did too. When she froze, he bristled. At one point, Juniper limped, favoring her front paw. Bruno noticed. He sniffed at her side, then lowered his head. Gently, he nudged her shoulder, the way he had once done to Matt after a long shift at the firehouse. Juniper didn't recoil. That was the third lesson. Even wild things accept comfort when it's offered without force. At night, they found shelter beneath a rock ledge. Juniper curled near the wall, her tail tucked. Bruno lay at the opening eyes facing the woods. That night, he didn't sleep. Something had shifted. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was guarding. On the third day, it rained again. Cold and constant, Juniper stayed beneath the ledge. Bruno paced. They didn't speak, but their rhythm had formed. Juniper didn't hunt that morning. Bruno, left alone, sniffed for food, came back with nothing but muddy paws. He licked his fur dry, starting at his leg, then paused. Juniper had a cut on her ear, again reopened by a branch. Bruno leaned in. She didn't move. He licked it slow and deliberate. Not a dominance move, not submission, just care. That was the fourth lesson. Connection doesn't always come from similarity. Sometimes it's found in mutual silence. Somewhere, Margaret was still calling. Her voice lived in Juniper's memory like a distant hum, low, familiar, steady. At night, Juniper's ears twitched at any sound that even vaguely resembled that voice. Bruno heard it too. But his loyalty wasn't just to sound, it was to presence. He missed Matt's smell, the way his boots clonked, the rhythm of his hand over fur. But more than that, Bruno missed being needed. In the forest, no one needed him, except maybe Juniper. By the fifth day, they were thinner, hungrier. Juniper tried to catch a squirrel, but lost it to a swooping hawk. Bruno chased a rabbit and returned with a limp. Still, they stayed together. They moved like a unit now, not perfectly, but in sync. Bruno barked only once, and only after Juniper had hissed at a coyote's scent near the ridge. They kept moving. That was the fifth lesson. Being together isn't about comfort. It's about not being alone when it's hardest. Somewhere near the seventh night, they rested beside a dry patch of fern. The moonlight caught Juniper's fur, making her glow slightly. Bruno leaned his heavy head against her side, not asking, just resting. Juniper blinked once, then didn't move. The wild had not tamed them, but it had revealed them. What Margaret and Matt had feared, a clash of teeth and territory, hadn't happened. Instead, nature had given them what fences never could: understanding. A moment came the next morning when they paused near the edge of the tree line. They saw movement people. A bicycle. A boy's voice. Juniper crouched low. Bruno stood tall. They didn't run. They watched. The boy had a paper in his hand. He looked up, eyes wide. They turned and vanished again, but slower this time. Not in fear, just caution. It was the forest that taught them caution could coexist with trust. That's the sixth lesson. Freedom isn't the absence of risk. It's knowing when to stay and when to return. Back in Haven Ridge, Margaret stared out at the forest line, still waiting. Matt stood beside her, holding binoculars, jaw tight. When the call came from the boy's parents, he saw them. They were together. Neither adult said much. Margaret simply closed her eyes. Matt went to get the truck. They weren't sure what they'd find. They only knew the forest hadn't swallowed them whole. It had reshaped them. The dog no one trusted with a wildcat had become her shelter. The wildcat no one believed could bond had chosen not to leave. It wasn't a miracle. It was biology meeting memory, instinct meeting trust, nature doing what it always does, testing what you're made of, then giving you back only what you earn. Fear tells us to separate, to fence off, to assume danger. But sometimes healing comes from letting things find each other on their own terms in their own time. Later, when Margaret and Matt walked to the edge of the woods, they didn't call loudly. They simply waited. They brought nothing but an open door. When they finally returned, fur matted and steps heavy, no one rushed forward. No one grabbed leashes. They were met with stillness, with open arms and soft breath. Because sometimes what the forest gives back isn't just survival, it's transformation. They appeared at dawn. No warning, no bark, no sound in the grass. Just presence. Margaret was sitting on the porch steps, wrapped in her wool cardigan, a mug cooling beside her knee. The sky hadn't yet brightened, but the birds had begun their chatter. She heard the shift of pine needles before she saw them. Then two figures emerged from the trees like ghosts returning to the world. Juniper first, Bruno a step behind, both thinner ribs showing beneath fur and muscle. Their gait was slow, not weak but careful. Juniper moved like fog, low silent eyes scanning. Bruno limped, favoring his left side, but his head was high-tailed down in a respectful sway. They paused at the edge of the yard. Margaret didn't rise. She didn't even blink. She just whispered, "You're home." Juniper stepped forward. Bruno stayed back at first, sniffing the air. Juniper reached the porch, looked up once, then rubbed the side of her face against the bottom step. Margaret let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. She opened her arms. "Come on, then." Juniper climbed slowly, pressing her head into Margaret's chest. Bruno moved next, not bounding, not barking, just walking one slow step at a time until he sat beside them, lowering himself to the porch boards with a grunt. It wasn't dramatic, no orchestral moment, just a stillness that hummed. Matt arrived 10 minutes later. He stopped in the driveway when he saw them, eyes wide. They came back. Margaret nodded. Before the sun, he crouched by Bruno, ran a hand along his back, and whispered something too low to hear. The next few hours were quiet. No questions, no rushing, no baths, just food, water, rest. Juniper drank deeply, then curled on the rug near the window. Bruno ate slowly, lay near the kitchen door, eyes half closed but alert. By afternoon, the porch felt full again. But things had changed. Juniper didn't go upstairs that night. She stayed by the heater vent. Bruno didn't bark once, even when the wind knocked a branch against the fence. They were not afraid, but they were different. Margaret noticed first. The way Juniper watched the trees with new caution. The way Bruno flinched when a car backfired 2 streets over. The forest had not broken them, but it had taught them. Healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about honoring what had been endured. Margaret began tending to small wounds. Juniper's cut along the back leg, Bruno's paw pad torn from the rough terrain. Neither resisted. They let her care for them in silence. Matt took over repairs on the broken gate. Not just patchwork, he rebuilt it. Stronger, taller, but with a small arched cutout at the bottom. For when they want to visit, he said. They'll visit? Margaret asked. Matt shrugged. Bruno will. The next day proved him right. After breakfast, Bruno wandered to the fence, sniffed the new gate, then looked back at Matt. Matt opened it. Bruno trotted across the yard, tail high, and lay down on Margaret's steps. Juniper stepped outside, stood in the doorway, and just looked at him. Then slowly she walked over and sat beside him. Not touching, but close. That afternoon they sunbathed in tandem. Juniper stretched long on the porch rail, Bruno sprawled beneath. Neighbors began to stop by. A woman brought a hand-drawn welcome home sign taped to a box of treats. Children peeked from the sidewalk, hoping to catch a glimpse of the wild cat baby who made friends with the big dog. Margaret greeted each of them with quiet gratitude. Juniper and Bruno didn't perform. They didn't need to. Healing is not a show. It's a process that happens in small, unnoticed ways. A week later, Juniper climbed onto the kitchen table for the first time in months. Margaret didn't scold. She simply set down an extra saucer of water. Matt started showing up more often, sometimes with groceries, sometimes just to sit. One evening, as the sky turned copper, he said, "They came back changed." Margaret nodded. So did we. That night they shared dinner on the porch. Nothing fancy, just soup and bread. Juniper rested at Margaret's feet. Bruno lay near Matt's chair. The silence between them felt earned. It wasn't long before the story spread. Someone posted a photo online, Juniper and Bruno side by side, eyes half closed under Margaret's rose trellis. It went viral, not in the flashy dramatic way, just quiet awe. The caption read, "A bobcat and a cane corso, both lost, both found, together." Comments poured in. I cried watching this. Animal companionship is everything. Proof that love doesn't follow rules. Wild animal rescue in its truest form. Margaret didn't read all of them, but she read enough to know something people needed this. They needed reminders that coexistence was still possible, that kindness between species, between strangers, still existed, that healing wasn't reserved for the lucky, but for the willing. The world rushes to separate. This is wild. That is tame. This is yours. That is mine. But love, real love, tends to ignore those lines. It listens instead to what's shared: hunger, safety, silence, home. Weeks passed. The porch became a common ground. Juniper and Bruno didn't always lie side by side, but they stayed close. When a child dropped a cracker near Juniper, Bruno sat still watching until the child backed away. When Bruno growled at a hawk overhead, Juniper stepped closer to him, not afraid. Margaret and Matt took slow walks, sometimes in silence, sometimes sharing stories. He talked about the fires, about the silence after them, about how Bruno had been the only thing that made sense during the divorce, how he'd lost so much and still somehow ended up here. Margaret shared less, just enough, about George, about her sister, about the quiet ache that comes when everyone thinks you're fine because you smile. They understood each other in the pauses. One evening, Bruno brought a stick to the porch and dropped it by Juniper. She didn't pick it up, but she didn't walk away either. That was enough. That night, Juniper curled closer to Margaret than usual. Her purring was more vibration than sound. Bruno lay by the door facing the wind, as if daring it to return. The house felt full again, not just of bodies, but of purpose. And when Margaret went to bed, she left the door open not out of habit, but out of trust. Healing had come home. But just as the heart begins to settle, life reminds us it's not done teaching. And when Margaret woke one stormy night with her chest tightening and her vision blurred, everything they'd rebuilt hung in the balance. The storm came fast. Not like the last one, which had crawled in on creaking limbs. This one arrived with the certainty of something overdue. Rain pelted the windows in wide sweeping gusts. Trees bowed, wind howled. Margaret woke just after midnight, disoriented breath shallow. She tried to sit up. Pain bloomed in her chest, sharp cold, unmistakable. She reached for the phone, knocked it from the nightstand, then slid to the floor, her breath shortening. The room spun. She whispered one name, Matt. In the next room, Juniper leapt from her perch. Her claws clicked once on the hard wood before she disappeared down the hall. Across the yard, Bruno stirred. He barked once urgent low, then howled. Matt, half asleep, bolted upright. He didn't think. He ran. The porch light still flickered as he burst through Margaret's back door. Juniper was at the base of the stairs, tail fluffed, eyes wide. Matt took them two at a time and found her on the floor beside the bed, hand on her chest, face pale. "Stay with me," he whispered, dialing 911. "I've got you. Just stay here." Margaret didn't speak. She looked at him just for a second and nodded. Juniper curled near her side. Bruno, now inside, paced the hallway, restless but silent. The ambulance came in minutes. The paramedics moved quickly. Margaret was conscious, but barely. Matt followed behind them in the storm windshield wipers, gasping. At the hospital, machines beeped and nurses buzzed. Matt sat in the waiting room, soaked to the bone, a paper cup of bad coffee untouched in his hands. Hours passed like fog. Then a doctor came out, calm but tired. "She had a minor heart attack," he said. "We stabilized her. She's awake, but she'll need rest and someone to help her recover." Matt just nodded. Back at the house, Juniper prowled every room. Bruno sat in the hallway, head pressed against the door. No one spoke, but something was missing. 3 days passed. Matt brought flowers, books, her favorite tea. On the 4th day, Margaret smiled, faint but real. "You stayed," she whispered. "I wasn't going anywhere." On the 5th day, the nurse let Bruno visit. She hesitated at first. He's huge, but the dog didn't bark once. He simply stepped beside the bed, lowered his head to Margaret's palm, and exhaled. Juniper followed that night, not allowed inside, but perched on the windowsill. Margaret smiled when she saw the shape through the glass. "I missed you too, sweetheart." She returned home a week later, slower, thinner, but alive. Matt installed new handrails, cooked, sat beside her as she napped in her chair. Sometimes they didn't talk at all, and that was enough. One morning, Margaret handed him a folded envelope. "Don't open it yet," she said. "It's not a goodbye. It's just something I wanted you to have if I ever couldn't say it." He didn't open it. He tucked it in the back of a book on her shelf. But 3 weeks later, as winter touched the treetops, she didn't wake up. It was peaceful. Juniper curled beside her shoulder. Bruno sat at the foot of the bed. Matt found them like that just after dawn. He didn't cry right away. He sat, held her hand, told her the porch flowers had bloomed early this year. Then, slowly, he reached for the book. The envelope was still there, yellowed, crisp. He opened it. "Dear Matt, I don't know when you'll read this. I hope it's not too soon. I hope I had more time. But if you're reading this now, then thank you for all of it. You gave me back something I hadn't had in years, company without condition. I always thought Juniper came to me because she needed saving, but I was the one who needed her. I didn't say it often, you know me, but I want to say it now. You are kind, you are steady, and even if the world tries to tell you otherwise, that matters more than you'll ever know. Take care of them, of Bruno, of Juniper if she lets you. She's more than wild, she's family, and you were never just a neighbor. You were the second chapter I didn't know I had. Tell them I said goodbye. Tell them I love them. Tell them they saved me." Margaret Matt folded the letter and didn't move for a long time. Later, after the funeral, simple, quiet, just the way she would have liked it. He placed that letter inside the small box of things she left behind. Her garden gloves, a half-finished drawing of Juniper asleep, one faded collar from when the Bobcat was small enough to wear it. He brought Juniper home with him. At first, she stayed by the door, silent, watching. Bruno lay near the fireplace. Every so often he'd lift his head and whimper. On the third day, Juniper jumped onto the couch, curled beside Bruno, and rested her head on his shoulder. Matt sat across from them and whispered, "She came back for you, you know." It didn't matter who he was talking to. Some truths don't need direction. A few days later, Matt opened the back gate and stood at the edge of the yard. The wind moved through the trees. He thought about Margaret, about everything she'd carried and never complained about. He thought about the quiet strength in her smile. He thought about how much better the world had become just by having her in it. Then he called Juniper's name. She came. Bruno followed. Together they walked back into the woods, not running, not escaping, just revisiting the place that had taught them who they were. The forest didn't feel as wild anymore, because part of her still lived there, in the way the pine needles swayed, in the sound of paws against earth, in the flicker of light through branches. Margaret had left, but what she built, love without expectation, trust without taming, remained. We can't control how long we have, but we can choose how deeply we show up. With animals, with people, with life. Margaret didn't tame the wild, she honored it, and in return, it loved her back. That night, Matt placed her garden hat on a hook by the door, not to forget, but to remember. And when Juniper curled up by the hearth and Bruno lay beside her, tail tapping once Matt didn't feel alone, he felt home. Love doesn't end with goodbye. It carries on in every morning ritual, every quiet walk, every shared breath between the wild and the willing. And sometimes the greatest stories are the ones that continue, even after the last page. A year passed. The house still creaked in the morning. The tea kettle still whistled at 6:30 sharp. Juniper still circled the rug 3 times before curling into her spot by the window, and Bruno still waited by the door every evening at dusk, as if listening for someone's footsteps. But Margaret's chair stayed empty. Matt didn't fill it. He left it by the fireplace cushion, fluffed a book, turned slightly as if she might return any moment to pick up where she'd left off. He dusted around it, never touching the mug she'd last used. A faint ring still marked the wood beneath it. Her presence wasn't loud. It was folded into the routine. There's something sacred about the rhythm of healing when it's shared. Animals feel it before we do. They sense what we haven't yet named. Bruno adjusted quickly. He'd always been good at taking cues. Matt's moods, his silences. But it was Juniper who surprised him. She didn't disappear. She didn't retreat to the trees. She stayed. She watched Matt more closely than ever. She waited by the door when he came home. She moved toward him not with affection exactly, but with permission. Love, after all, doesn't always look like closeness. Sometimes it just means choosing to stay. Matt built her a perch near the window, padded with an old wool coat Margaret used to wear in the garden. Juniper took to it immediately. She'd sit there for hours, blinking slowly, tail curling in thought. Outside that window, the world turned seasons, shifted, flowers bloomed and died, and the tall cedar trees held stories the wind never told. In the spring, Matt opened the gate again and began walking the trails they once searched so desperately. Not to chase anything now, just to remember. Bruno led the way, nose to the ground, tail high. Juniper followed from a distance, stepping with purpose, a silent guardian of the path. On those walks, Matt thought often about what Margaret had left behind. Not just the letter, not even the memory of her voice or the warmth of her home. What she'd truly left was proof. Proof that healing didn't have to be loud, that companionship didn't have to be conventional, that even in a world obsessed with training and taming, some of the most profound relationships came from simply allowing something to be exactly what it is. And that changed how Matt lived. He started leaving his phone behind more often. He began writing not stories, but observations. Moments. The way Juniper pressed her paw gently on Bruno's back when he dreamed too loud. The way Bruno stepped aside when she approached the food dish, always respectful. The way both of them looked at him, sometimes not as a master, but as something softer part of their circle. He wrote it all down in a small notebook and titled it, "Things You Can Only Learn from Animals." One entry read, "Silence is not emptiness. It's where trust grows." Another, "The world says wild is dangerous, but maybe wild is just honest." Juniper never became a pet. Bruno never lost his alertness. But together, they built something stable, something quiet and steady, a form of companionship that didn't need commands or conditions, just presence. People in town started to notice. Kids waved when they passed. One woman left a bouquet of wildflowers on the front steps with a note, "For the cat who reminded me that grief doesn't mean forgetting." And when someone sent Matt a video link of a similar story, an older woman who had raised a wild fox and shared her garden with it until her last days. He watched it, then watched it again, not for the viral, cute animal content, but for the connection. Because that's what animal rescue is really about. Not saving them from nature, but inviting them into a place where nature and nurture don't cancel each other out. He watched more wildcat baby stories, animal companionship clips, rescue animals transformed by love, and each one reminded him of Margaret, not in her final days, but in those quiet ones before, when she sat on the porch and simply listened to the world breathing around her. Matt understood something then. Margaret hadn't rescued Juniper. Juniper had rescued Margaret from loneliness, from stillness, from the lie that aging meant fading. Bruno. He hadn't just protected Matt. He had helped him rebuild trust in himself, in others, in what comes next. That's what real rescue does. It doesn't just save lives, it reshapes them. Matt eventually opened the house to others. Not many, just a few. A neighbor's teenage son who had trouble connecting with people found himself sitting on the porch, gently tossing Juniper bits of chicken. A retired vet with arthritis stopped by to help care for Bruno's joints. A local teacher brought her class to sketch the animals from the sidewalk, whispering as if in church. No one got too close. That was the unspoken rule. But the respect was mutual, the healing shared. Matt kept writing. He never published anything, but he kept a stack of notebooks by the door. The last page of the last one said, "We all leave something behind. Make it something that teaches others how to love." In a world that often moves too fast, the animals remind us to pause, to observe, to let things unfold. The wild cat doesn't chase attention. The rescue dog doesn't perform. They simply live fully presently, without apology. And in doing so, they invite us to do the same. So maybe this isn't just a story about a bobcat and a dog. Maybe it's about all of us. The parts of us that are still untamed, still searching for connection, still hoping to be understood without having to explain. Maybe it's about the people we've lost who left behind more than absence. They left behind a rhythm, a quiet place to return to. And maybe if we're paying attention, we'll hear it. In the stillness, in the soft steps of a creature returning home, in the breath we take before saying something true. In the memory of someone who gave us the space to heal. Margaret did that. Juniper and Bruno lived it. And Matt, he carries it forward one quiet day at a time. Now I'll turn it to you. Have you ever been rescued by an animal? Or changed by one, not in the big obvious ways, but in the small ones? If this story stirred something in you, pause for a moment. Breathe, let that feeling settle, then share it. Tell us about the animal who stayed, or the one who left, or the one you're still waiting for. I hope this little bobcat stays with you long after the screen fades. And if you feel like helping this story reach someone else, super thanks is your gentle ripple forward. And if you believe like Margaret did that love comes in all forms, and sometimes in fur, in claws, or in the echo of paws on wood, consider joining us here. Like this video. Subscribe to the channel, not because of algorithms, but because there's still room in this world for quiet stories that matter, and we'd be honored to share them with you.